Good evening and welcome to Emmanuel Christian Seminary at Milligan. My name is Ron Castens and I'm privileged to serve as the Dean here at Emmanuel. And we are thrilled once again to host the Ross Smith Lectures in Pastoral Care. The Ross Smith Lectures in Pastoral Care were endowed as a biennial lecture in 2013 by Calvin and Nancy Ross. As a legacy of their ministries, but also in memory of Calvin's parents, Walter and Mardell Ross, and Nancy's father, Frank Smith. This lectureship continues to be a tremendous blessing to those who are carrying on the ministerial work of pastoral care and to those who are preparing to do so as seminary students. We are deeply indebted to Calvin and Nancy, who are with us tonight, and I'd like to invite Dr. Ross to the podium to share a few words.
Well, thank you, Dean Castens. I appreciate your leadership and Dr. Hollins in organizing these lectures for us. Yes, Nancy and I are very pleased to provide this lectureship as a biennial experience in honor of the memory of our parents, Walter and Mardell Ross and Frank and Hilda Smith. Our relationship with Emmanuel began 61 years ago, and I was in the entering class in the fall of 1965. And actually, the family relationship began before then. But Nancy's father, Frank Smith, was on the committee chaired by Dean Walker back in the day to plan and provide support to begin a new seminary in Upper East Tennessee in connection with Milligan. There was some sentiment at that time, as I understand it, for that seminary to begin in Knoxville, maybe in connection with Johnson Bible College at the time, but we're glad that Milligan won out. Pastoral care has been a theme of my ministry and teaching over the years, and there are different ways to define pastoral care. In order probably to define it as best that I know how, I refer you to two books by my former professors. One is a book by Wayne Oates, O-A-T-E-S, Wayne Oates, called The Christian Pastor. The Christian Pastor. And the other book is by Seward Hiltner, H-I-L-T-N-E-R, Seward Hiltner, Toward a Theology of Pastoral Care, toward a Pastoral Theology. Those books would be very helpful in understanding some definitions for the history and the practice of pastoral care. So we're very grateful to provide this lectureship, and we're pleased that you're here this evening to help us grab a hold the banner of pastoral care and hold it high. Thank you.
Yes, we're so grateful, Calvin and Nancy, for your generosity and your investment in future generations that pastoral care, good pastoral care, can continue for many years to come. We are delighted this year to have Dr. Richard Beck serve as our lecturer for the Ross Smith Lectures in Pastoral Care. Dr. Beck is professor in the Department of Psychology at Abilene Christian University and is the senior fellow of the Saunders Center for Joy and Human Flourishing. Whether in the classroom or through his books or blog, his passion for educating people to make a difference in the name of Christ in our world is evident. He also teaches in the Doctor of Ministry programs, both at ACU and at Fuller Theological Seminary. Beyond his work as a scholar and an educator, Dr. Beck leads a weekly Bible study at a maximum security prison and also preaches at Freedom Fellowship, a church planted by the Highland Church of Christ that welcomes the homeless, the mentally disabled, the criminal, the addicted, the hungry, and the abandoned. And Dr. Beck says he started working with inmates at the French Robertson prison for the same reason that he joined Freedom Fellowship, simply obedience to Jesus. He explained it this way. He said, Jesus said, visit prisoners. He said, that's where you'd find him. And so I went to the prison. So we're grateful for that and his work as a teacher and an author, and grateful he's traveled all the way to Eastern Tennessee from Abilene, Texas, to share with us about the shape of joy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Beck.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. It's easy to accept an invitation to Tennessee from Texas. It's prettier here than where I live. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I remember I was not home anymore when I was sitting on my front porch and a tumbleweed blew by. And I was like, okay, all right, we are out here in the middle of nowhere. Anyway, thank you for the invitation. So glad to get to meet Calvin and Nancy and be part of the legacy of your families as a part of Emmanuel. So thank you. Glad you're all here. The shape of joy, transcendence and human flourishing. Anybody need a little joy at this point in your life? The title of the talk comes from a book I released about a year and a half ago called The Shape of Joy. And it's a popular book. It's not an academic book. It's the kind of book you just hand to anybody in your family. It's my take on where I think the field of positive psychology has been going and what it's pointing to. Maybe connecting some dots that aren't normally connected this way amongst more of our less religiously inclined, scholars. And if you don't know anything about positive psychology, I'll talk a little about this more tomorrow. But in 1998, Martin Seligman, big name in psychology, discovered learned helplessness and other sorts of things, kind of declared in his APA presidential address to the field of psychology that it was time to create a new science of positive psychology. And although we've been talking about human flourishing since ancient times, going all the way back to the virtue tradition of the Greeks, psychology turned about 30 years ago its empirical attention, like what can we know scientifically, empirically about joy and flourishing. And though the fruits of that have been trickling into the wellness discourse for years, I'm sure you all know that you need to be practicing gratitude. You're aware of that, okay? Have you ever heard about mindfulness? Okay, you have to go outside and touch grass. Okay, so a lot of this has been already leaked out into the popular culture. Books have been written, podcasts have been sharing a lot of the fruits of this, but I do think that one big overarching conclusion hasn't been underlined, and I would like to kind of use this presentation to draw that conclusion out over the course of 3 lectures. Now, if you can only be with us tonight, I will at least give a hint about where that's going. You won't leave completely unsatisfied, so I will try to bring each lecture to a good conclusion for you tonight, so you can get a peek about where we're ultimately headed. So to frame the conversation tonight, and I want to use this as something to kind of bridge us through all 3 lectures. I want to tell you a story about a conversation I had with a student of mine named Brad back in the early 2000s when the new atheist movement was at its peak. Some of you guys maybe don't remember this, but does anybody know the new atheist movement? There was a group of writers that were writing some very aggressive, polemical books attacking Christianity. So, there was the old atheists, I guess Nietzsche and Freud, but these were the new atheists. These were the cool atheists. And so Christopher Hitchens wrote a book, right? God is not great. Sam Harris wrote a book called The End of Faith. Daniel Dennett wrote a book called The God, Delusion. So these titles were just kind of dropping on the Christian community and upon my college students and shaking them up, disturbing them a little bit. And so Brad, really precocious, smart student, had read some of these books, found them very compelling, and just wanted to talk about the faith. And so we sat down over coffee and we had this conversation. And, the questions that he asked are the questions that I'm sure, many of us face. How do you reconcile science in the first chapters of Genesis? Why does God let bad things happen to good people? Well, what do you do with the accounts of violence in the Old Testament? So it was a very long, wandering conversation, and I tried to do the best I could over about 2 hours to give the best answers I could to some of those questions. But as you know, right, there's no final answer. There are maybe better questions and better answers, but we just kind of keep peeling that onion throughout our lives as we grow deeper into faith. But as we were ending, I thought I would kind of maybe turn the tables a little bit on Brad. And I said to him, Brad, you've asked me a lot of questions, and I've done the best I can to answer those questions. But before we go, can I ask you one question? And he said, sure. And I said, okay, here it is. I said, Brad, do you want to live a beautiful life? And it wasn't the question he was expecting. But he thought about it and go like, yeah, I do want to live a beautiful life. And I told him, I do too. But it raises this deeper question about what is beautiful. Like, what is your aesthetic? How do you judge what the beautiful life is? And I said, Brad, this might seem really weird, but one of the things I know about myself is that whenever I see something online or like something viral goes around social media, or it's a news clip of something that moves my heart or brings tears to my eyes, I always notice that those stories always remind me of Jesus. So it might be strange, but I'm into Jesus for artistic reasons. I like that aesthetic, and that's how I judge the beautiful life. So I want to kind of throw that out there because I want to come back to this idea about value and transcendence, the true, the beautiful, and the good, and what those questions of the transcendent might have for our mental health and our flourishing and our joy. So lecture 1, I want to talk a little bit about the roots of our mental health crisis and what I think is going on. What I describe in The Shape of Joy is the collapse of the self, okay? Okay, a lot of ways we can introduce the mental health crisis. I just grabbed this. This came out on the New York Times last year. A group of economists and sociologists and psychologists created this report card of the health of the nation. You can go online right now and look at how we're doing. This is a snapshot recently about various dashboard indicators about how America is doing. And as you see in the middle, I selected how we're doing financially. I know things are pinched right now, but if you look at the stock market and the GDP, America, things just keep getting there in the center. They keep improving. Things are getting better, even with inflation. In this metric, there's been no more affluent, wealthy society in the history of the world. And yet, as I've gathered around that graph, other indicators of our emotional well-being. As you see, the trend on depression and anxiety is worsening. We see increasing rates of depression and anxiety, seeing increasing rates of suicide, part of a collection of what are called the deaths of despair, which you might have heard of, that are on the rise. Deaths of despair are deaths due to suicide, fatal drug overdoses, and also chronic liver disease due to alcoholism. And then also you just see when we ask people how your life is going, rates of life satisfaction are also declining. And so the question is, like, what's going on? There is material abundance and affluence, but around it, all of these mental health indicators. And what's interesting also about that is more people are in therapy than they've ever been in therapy in the history of the world. More people on our anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication than they have been in the history of the world. And so even though we have, problems in our mental health care system, more people are getting mental health care than they've ever got before. More people are willing to admit they got mental health problems than ever before. And yet, despite all of the billions of dollars we're throwing at those problems, things are getting worse. So the question is, why? So I want to try to give you a part of the answer. There are many things that we could talk about the roots and the sources of our mental health crisis. I'm just going to give you one perspective. And the argument I want to make is that Something has happened over the last 100 or so years that has changed or reconfigured the shape of the self. That's where the shape of joy comes. There's a geometry at the heart of our crisis, kind of a curvature of the self that is exacerbating and even fragilizing our mental health, okay? So I'm going to tell this story, and I'm going to blame these two guys right here, okay? You need somebody to blame. And so I'm going to point a finger at, as many who these people are, you probably know Sigmund Freud, but the other gentleman there is not one of the three musketeers. That is René Descartes, okay? So René Descartes and Freud. This is not just my analysis. Many sociologists point to Descartes and Freud as critical. Charles Taylor tells a little bit about this in his book, The Sources of the Self. And so why would we talk about these two gentlemen in the collapsing of the self? So for Descartes, there are two things that are implicated. One is his exercise in what's called Cartesian doubt. And the other piece of his work is Cartesian dualism. So I know not everybody's experts, so let me just briefly explain. Descartes was famous in a book he called The Meditations, and I think everybody's heard of this. In the Meditations, he utters this famous phrase in Latin. Does everybody know what it is? Cognito ergo sum, which is, I think, therefore I am. That might be the only thing we remember from philosophy, you know. Maybe Socrates is know thyself, perhaps, but I think, therefore I am. Okay, so if you don't know anything about what he was doing with the Meditations, is this. He was trying to establish truth and certainty on rock-solid foundations. And normally when you think about establishing truth, most of us are empiricists. Things are true because they're real, you know. But he said, how do you know this isn't, you know, a delusion sent to you by a demon? Today, people speculate whether or not we're all in some sort of vast cosmic virtual simulation. You guys have heard of this? You know, you can get really sci-fi. You might be in the Matrix. Okay? So he's like, okay, I can't trust my perceptions. So he retreats into himself. And now he's just alone with his thoughts. And he wants to begin this journey to rock-solid certainty and truth. And the first truth that is rock-solid, absolutely certain, is, I'm thinking. Therefore, the first fact that we can build this edifice of truth on is, I exist. Okay? And this idea of doubting everything in the world, but beginning with the self, is an exercise of what philosophers call Cartesian doubt. And it flip-flopped where truth is located. Do you all see how that happens? Instead of truth being located out there, and coming into agreement with the truth, where is truth now shifted towards? It's shifted toward the center of the self. And so you can ripple out from there all sorts of epistemological consequences when the self becomes the final arbiter and judge of the truth. The mind is the curtain, and the world out there becomes the source of skepticism. The other thing that Descartes was known for is positing what's called Cartesian dualism. Descartes looked at the human person and animal life, and he said, okay, there are two kinds of substances in the world. There is material things, and then there are minds. Right? There's mental stuff, and then there is actual physical stuff. And so the world splits. It's why it's called dualism. It's split into two parts. There is the mental, and then there is the material, right? There are subjects, my ego, myself, and then there are, surrounding me, objects, okay? Why did that create a collapse of the self? Well, going back to those transcendentals I talked about before, the true, the beauty, and the full good, these used to be considered to be outside in the world. Right? The true and the beautiful and the good were things that existed independently of me. This is what Plato argued, right? These things existed independently of me. And now obviously Christians would locate the true and the beautiful and the good in the reality of God. And I would therefore need to leave myself and seek attunement with those truths outside of me. But the minute Descartes split the world into the mental and the physical, the true and the beautiful and the good became judgments of the self. They became subjective. What is good? No, not much anymore, right? Because the self decides, what is good, what is beautiful, right? Have you ever gone to a modern art museum? Opinions vary on what's beautiful. You're like, what is that? Like aesthetics differ, Your favorite movie might not be my favorite movie. Aesthetics differ. Okay? And what is true in a post-truth, fake news kind of world? And so suddenly now, these transcendentals used to be something that I would seek outside of myself and come into harmony with. Now they're just subjective states that anybody could just kind of disagree with. And all of that gets pivoted inside the mind. So one way to think about what has happened because of Descartes is the loss of what Martin Buber would call an I-thou relationship. Martin Buber was a Jewish theologian and philosopher, and he said there are two kinds of relations. One relation with the world is an I-thou relationship. There's me, the self, the ego, and then there's a reality outside of me that I experience as a real relationship, as personalized. Okay? What does that mean, though? I think a really helpful bit of sociological research here comes from the sociologist Hartmut Rosa. You guys had Andrew Root here 2 years ago, and Root has done a lot of good work in explicating some of Rosa's work. And Hartmut Rosa describes that the I-thou relation with the world is a relation of resonance. That maybe there is a kind of vibration, there is a kind of harmony, a give and take between me and reality. A fullness exists in that relationship. And be like, well, what does that mean? Is that just mere poetry? And so Hartmut Rosa talked about how that resonance has four aspects to it. Number one, that reality external to me can speak. I can be addressed by reality. Reality poses a question to me that I feel like I need to answer. Biblically, right, we know the Psalms, right? The heavens declare the glory of God. Then it goes on and says, no speech is heard. So in one sense, you could walk out and look at the heavens and nature, and it's not resonant. It's mute, right? No, I don't hear anything. You can tap somebody on the shoulder and go like, do you hear it? No. But the psalmist goes on, and yet that speech pours forth through the world. So one person can experience a sunrise as deeply resonant. I'm being addressed via a divine communication. A communication that might demand something of me today by way of wakefulness or even moral responsibility. But another person just doesn't hear it at all, right? So we can be addressed by the world. Secondly, we can respond to it like I've been describing. You can respond with care, with an ethical concern. Think about just the resonance of human persons. When human persons lose resonance, they're just in your way. Okay? Have you guys ever been like in traffic? You're standing in line and you're like, who are all these objects? There's just all these meat obstacles in my way, Instead, a resonant relation is like, these aren't like just, bits of inert furniture that I bump into. These are like people that demand sacred recognition. I'm being addressed by an ethical duty to respond to that moral call. I need to treat that person not as the furniture in the background of my life, but as a duty. The relationship can change us. And so there's a sense where it's not just asymmetrical, that there's a give and take there. I can respond to that call and be changed by the encounter. And then lastly, importantly, it can't be controlled, right? This is a reality other than your own. Thus, it can't cannot be put to your use. It cannot be commodified. You can't conjure it up at will. God cannot be put at your disposal. And so these experiences tend to be interruptions rather than things that we can utilize in our, for our life projects. So when I speak of an I-thou relationship, I'm talking about going through life like this. And Rosa talks about different axes of resonance. I've talked about a couple. A human resonance. Are people just obstacles, or are they children of God? I look at nature. Is it just pretty, or do I hear the Creator speaking to me? Think about a resonant relationship with your work. Is it a job, or is it a vocation? One is not resonant. The other is with a sacred fullness. And on it goes in our relations with all sorts of things, whether or not we feel like we're being spoken to, addressed out of that relation. Okay. When you lose that, though, then Buber describes that your relationship with the world becomes I-it. Instead of a thou that can speak and I can answer and we can be changed, instead it's just an object. And this is what Charles Taylor and Andrew Root would describe as the disenchantment of the world. I'm alone in my mind as a self, as an ego, and I'm just surrounded by inert stuff. And so the world is vacated of the sacred, and I'm just surrounded by the building blocks, the periodic table, inert stuff. And I'm not being addressed by that, so it's a relation of, Rose would describe it as a relation of deadness. Okay. All right, now let's talk about Dr. Freud, okay? Like I mentioned early on, that prior towards kind of the Freudian turn, mental health, wellness, we'll talk about this tomorrow, eudaimonia, the good life, well-being, or flourishing, was found not inside of yourself, but it found in moving outside yourself towards a transcendent, sacred reality and coming into harmony or attunement with it. But with Dr. Freud, there was this, what I would describe as like this inward turn. Mental health is no longer pursued through attunement with a sacred reality, coming into agreement with it. Instead, as you know, turn inside yourself and go into the unconscious and plumb the depths of your unconscious and get yourself sorted out. All right? And that inward turn it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. And it comes in all different versions where we're trying to kind of make sense of ourselves and get a handle of ourselves. Like, how many of y'all know your Enneagram number? Yeah. Or, your Myers-Briggs inventory, or maybe you've taken a quiz and you know what Disney princess you are or something. I don't know anymore, Anyway, just kind of figure out myself and get a diagnosis and I'll get it sorted. But what has happened, though? One of the things that has happened is that our mental health, I would argue, has become very self-referential. That with the Freudian turn toward the self, looking for the keys to wellness, that we've gotten stuck inside of there. And for example, some examples of getting stuck inside ourselves. Ethan Cross, psychologist Ethan Cross, has done a lot of work on this. He's got a great book called Chatter, summarizing his empirical research. The subtitle of the book is The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters, and How to Harness It. And this is his, summary of the empirical literature on this introspective turn that we have noticed in the last generation or two. Here's Cross. In recent years, a robust body of new research has demonstrated that when we experience distress, engaging in introspection often does significantly more harm than good. It undermines our performance at work, it interferes with our ability to make good decisions, and negatively influences our relationships. This introspection can promote violence and aggression and contribute to a range of mental disorders and enhance our risk of becoming physically ill. So as many psychologists will tell you, that one of the worst things you could do is get stuck in ruminating, looping patterns. And much of our mental health crisis is due to a whole generation or two getting stuck inside themselves and chasing their own mind. Now, I want to be clear, sometimes people are confused on this point. I'm not suggesting that psychotherapy and doing the work of therapy that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the introspective looping. And I want to be clear about this. There are some forms of psychotherapy that do exacerbate that rumination. And this is actually the story of the invention of cognitive therapy by Aaron Beck. CBT, you may or may not know, cognitive behavioral therapy, is one of the most effective treatments out there, empirically speaking. But it was discovered because Aaron Beck was a psychiatrist, and he was treating depressed patients with Freudian psychoanalysis, which involved taking them back to their traumas, revisiting those traumas, ruminating on those traumas, session after session after session. And he noticed that they weren't getting better, all right? And he noticed it's because they seemed to be getting overly entangled with their thoughts and re-entangled over and over again. And so he describes, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, a process that he called distancing. The people needed to step back a little bit from their thoughts to get a little bit more objectivity. And so I'm not talking about this in the lectures, but part 2 of my book is on this journey from the introverted, collapsed self to where we're turning in these lectures towards transcendence, this middle step about stepping away, stepping back a little bit. In fact, the hot new thing in cognitive behavioral therapy is ACT, acceptance and commitment-based therapy. And one of the things that what ACT has done is it's pushed that idea of disengaging thoughts even further. If you know the principles of acceptance and commitment-based therapy, where cognitive therapy was to kind of grab a hold of those negative thoughts and do like cognitive restructuring, like you have a thought to yourself like, I'm fat, or I'm stupid, or I'm a terrible mom, or students, like I'm an imposter, like those negative thoughts pop up. And the idea was like, watch for those negative thoughts and grab a hold of it and then kind of do some cognitive restructuring and have a healthier thought, It's better to think, I would like to lose some weight than I'm fat, right? That hits differently. If you get... It feels differently, say, like, I'm not very good at math, but I'm good at a lot of other things, rather than I'm dumb, right? So that's cognitive structuring. But ACT says, don't touch the thoughts. Like, the more you pay attention to them, like, you're going to have thoughts. You're aware, And if you chase them and engage them, what will happen? You're going to get stuck in your head. And so the idea is like to learn, and this is where ACT will point to mindfulness practice. So why is mindfulness so important, right? Being aware, it's stopping the chatter in your head and getting you reconnected to where you are, in your environment. And so the idea is to just let them go. Don't try to even debate them. Just let them fly by, and stay oriented towards your goals and your values, and don't entangle those inner demons. You'll get stuck in there. So I think that's a part of what's happened to us. That our mental health has become really self-referential, no longer attunement to the good or to realities outside of yourself. Instead, we're chasing a dog chasing its tail in our head. Another example of this that I talk about is Matthew Crawford describes in his book, The World Beyond Your Head, what he describes as the current ailment of our era, and he describes it as the weariness of the self. So here's a quote from Matthew Crawford to illustrate this self-referentiality. He said, "Now, once upon a time, our problem was guilt, the feeling that you have made a mistake with reference to something forbidden. And this was felt to be a stain on your character, right? So back to that idea of attunement, it used to be like there were rules and there was a judge in the sky, and I was out of attunement with that, and that made me feel, shame or guilt. So that used to be your problem. You were out of tune. You were misaligned with that reality. But again, with the Freudian turn away from that concern about attunement, he says what happened was, he goes, today, though, the dichotomy of the forbidden and the allowed has been replaced with the axis of the possible and the impossible. So the question that now hovers over your character is no longer how good you are, but how capable you are, where your capacity is measured in something like kilowatt hours, just your raw capacity to make things happen. And with this shift comes a new pathology, right? New diseases. The affliction of guilt has given way to weariness. Weariness with the vague and unending project of having to become your fullest self. Does that sound like the modern age? People don't feel guilty, probably. Like, do you think you're going to hell? Is God judging you? Do you feel tired? And do you feel, how much of this is experiences like self-fatigue? Are you tired of yourself? I know I am. Does anybody feel this? I'm just tired of this whole project, this thing I got going, and I think this is one of the reasons why social media has exacerbated the weariness, because now the self has become very entrepreneurial, right? You have to become a self. The self has become very performative, and it's become very curated. And there's kind of a exhaustion to that becoming. And so when Abraham Maslow said, you need to self-actualize, a lot of us burnt out halfway there. We're just like, I don't self-actualize. I'm just trying to do the dishes and put the kids to bed. I don't know, my optimal self. Now it's hanging over my character. Can you get it done? Can you make things happen? Okay, so that is a bit of the story here. There's more to tell, but the argument I'm going to make tonight is one of the roots of a mental health crisis is because the self has collapsed and it's turned inward. That our mental health has become very self-referential. And there's a variety of pathologies that are related to that, and a lot of that has fragilized our mental health. So, like I told you, I would end with some good news. So if I just ended there and go we'll see you guys tomorrow, some of you guys would never hear the end. It was just really depressing what happened last night. So let me try to give you a hint about where I think we need to be going a little bit. This is a peekaboo into tomorrow's lecture about transcendence, okay? So let me talk about restoring a lost relation with reality, right? The reality outside our head, like we've talked about, has become inert, devoid, dead. There's nothing really out there. And so if you want meaning or purpose or mental health, it's got to be an internal journey with the chatter in your head. One of the chapters in my book, I talk about our self-esteem culture and how self-esteem has become a bit of a trap. For a generation or two, we've believed that self-esteem, how I evaluate myself, is integral to mental health. If we could just instill self-esteem in ourselves, in our children, then that will be the foundation of mental health. But do you know where self-esteem came from? It was first described by William James in the late 1800s. William James, one of the most significant early American psychologists. He wrote a book called The Principles of Psychology. Many of you might know James as the author of The Varieties of Religious Experience. Some of you might know William James as one of the founders of the philosophical tradition called American Pragmatism. But in my field, he's one of the most significant psychologists. And in Principles of Psychology, he coined, many famous things. You guys ever heard of the stream of consciousness? That's William James. Have you guys ever heard of self-esteem? That's William James. And William James said, What is this? What is this feeling I have about myself? And he says, it's an equation. It's an equation. It's a ratio, division. Some of you guys got some math phobia, but this is just division. It is the ratio of your successes over your pretensions. Or as the way I describe it to my students, the life you have and the life you want, right? The successes and the pretensions, the goals, the ideal. It's the difference between the actual and the ideal, right? And self-esteem is this little thing in your head that tells you how that's going. And we built an entire culture on that equation. And then we wonder where our mental health has gone, right? Like, self-esteem is a feedback system. It's not a foundation. It's just telling you how well things are going, and often not well, all right? You know, I mean, like, so we've put, so you got to lean on this thing that's not there. It's not a thermostat. It's a thermometer. It just tells you how things are going. And we just kind of set our whole culture on top of that feedback loop. A more modern one is the Baumeister's definition. Self-esteem is called the sociometer. So it is a thermometer of your social life, a sociometer. And it basically just gives you feedback about how included, popular, liked, loved you are. So it's just kind of the thing, a part of our social, like we're social animals, so you need some software in your mind to tell you how well you're doing socially. And this is why it's the sociometer is why loneliness is painful, why solitary confinement is a punishment, because we feel isolation as pain. Well, is that any better as a foundation of mental health? On the day you get divorced, on the day when you're a young adolescent and you're experiencing FOMO on social media, right? What's the sociometer telling you then? Right, on the day you get your heart broken, and as we know, a couple years ago, the Surgeon General talked about this epidemic. You know what it is? It's as lethal as being a pack-a-day smoker. You know what it is? Loneliness. So how's everybody's sociometer doing? My point is, even that definition is not a really stable feedback loop. Like, you need something on the day your heart is broken. You need something other to lean on. So where are we going to get this from? So at this point, you were like, that was still sad. You never got to the happy. So here's the happy part, okay? As positive psychologists have gone out there and they have talked to and measured the happiest people in the world, you know, they've found some things. And as you know, they found out that a lot of those people are very grateful. Right? So that's why the recommendation to practice gratitude is so ubiquitous right now, because the happiest people in the world are grateful people. But one of the most resilient predictors, not resilient, most robust predictors of mental health and well-being, especially when you look at the literature on meaning in life, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but of the things that the ingredients that make up a meaningful life, the ingredient that is the most robust and consistent predictor of wellness and flourishing and joy is a variable the psychologists call cosmic significance or existential mattering. And so here you have these empirical psychologists using words like cosmic or existential. But it mattering points to just this conviction that your life matters. And sometimes we just call it that, mattering. And some people have that conviction, and people who have it are really resilient from a mental health perspective. Any Brene Brown fans here? You guys might recall the TED Talk that made Brene Brown. It wasn't even a TED Talk, it was a TEDx talk, University of Houston. She was just a social worker, right? And this is the TEDx talk that launched her into superstardom. And it was her research on shame resiliency. And if you remember that talk, she was trying to get to the heart of these people who are shame resilient, the people who can dare greatly. And as she tells it, she's like, doing this big coding of all the different, cases that she had, trying to find that critical distinction between those who could dare greatly and those who were crippled by shame. And she said her big discovery was there was only one variable that separated the shame resilient from those that are hampered by shame. Do you remember what it was? It's on the screen. The people that were shame resilient felt, knew that they were what? Worthy of love and belonging. Existential mattering, cosmic significance. I am just because I am worthy. Okay? And so instead of manufacturing your significance through rehabilitating self-regard, we recognize our significance as something that is just true. It is just an existential, ontological, cosmic, given. Otherwise, we're doomed to what I had on the prior slide, the constant rehabilitation over and over again of our self-regard. And that's exhausting work. So I tell this story in the book, how one day I came home, I came out the house, and I was going to drive the car, and I noticed that one of the back tires was like slightly deflated. And it wasn't so flat that I just needed to change it, but also it was flat enough I didn't want to drive it. So I was in between, looking at this kind of half-inflated tire. And I said to myself, man, I wish I had one of those like electric, you plug them into your 12-volt thing and plug, does anybody have one of those? Yeah. Well, I didn't. I do now, because of what happened next. I'm looking at that machine, thinking about that machine, and I'm looking at my tire, and I looked at the valve of the tire, and I realized, you know what? That valve on my tire is the same valve size as my bike pump. And so I went to the shed and tried my experiment. And I learned two things that day. Number one, you can totally do it. You can inflate a car tire with a bike pump. Lesson two, it's exhausting. So I tried it more. You were out there forever. And this is Texas, it's like 105 degrees. I was out there like 30 minutes, And my wife had a girlfriend come over, and she's like, what is your husband, like she just sees me out there like, and they look out the window at me like I'd lost my mind. And for me, that's the metaphor of self-esteem culture. Right? That you inflate yourself up, and then the air leaks out. And then, we put another sticky note on the window, on the mirror, we're constantly trying to talk ourselves into this, and the air keeps, leaking out. And that's the weariness, that's the weirdness of the self. Where positive psychology is pointing to this, our significance is not anything we manufacture or rehabilitate. It's not you working at the way of the bike pump of your self-regard. It is rather this receiving your significance as a gift or grace. Or to kind of connect this with pastoral counseling, because I don't know if you noticed that, it's one thing to describe existential significance or cosmic mattering. It's very vague about where that is coming from, okay? Especially if you are operating from a purely psychological perspective without any sort of metaphysical or spiritual grounding, then you can be tempted into thinking this, you are worthy, you are mattering, as cosmic significance, existential significance. It's just, you're still just talking to yourself. It's another, it's like a mind trick. It's like the Jedi mind trick. You look in the mirror and go, you are worthy, you believe it. But again, this can't be, again, the self-rehabilitation of self-regard. It's got to be something extrinsic to yourself that isn't manufactured. It isn't a pep talk. It's not another sticky note on the bathroom mirror. It is a recognized truth, but without any sort of metaphysical understanding of where that is coming from. It can be just kind of hanging out in the middle of the air. Thus, the outward turn that I'm talking about. So positive psychologists have pointed in the direction toward transcendence, that our mental health, when it becomes excessively self-referential, fragilizes. But when it operates out of a sense of a relation or attunement to a value beyond myself, that I just simply receive my significance instead of convince myself of my significance, then we step into experience of grace, right? Then suddenly we are in a resonant relationship with ourselves now. Does it make sense? Instead of you just being an inert substance that I gotta somehow like. Okay, I have to like this object. Instead, a resonant relationship with yourself is that I am being spoken to and step into a prior parental relationship. So a little nod here toward the end, toward object relations theory. Anybody? A lot of mental health professionals here know object relations theory. In the generations after Freud, object relations therapists kind of basically took this basic idea from Freud. Like a lot of his stuff about early childhood was frankly bizarre, okay? But the importance of childhood in the parental milieu, we carried that forward. And he gets credit for putting early childhood as a casting a long shadow in our mental health journeys. He gets credit for that. But the object relations people took it and kind of updated the theory. And the basic idea is that you become a self only in relation to another. And you know this. You know the stories of babies in orphanages that aren't picked up, that they develop attachment-related issues because you need another self to be in relation with. I don't know who I am unless I'm pinging off of something. And if there's nothing there, right, going back to this isolated remember the Cartesian ego, sitting alone with itself with nothing to push back on, nothing to get feedback about, it putrefies the self. The mind poisons itself when it's left alone. As God said, right? It's not good for us to be alone. And so I become a self in relationship, okay? And this is where I would push back on Buber. Buber said there's an I-thou relationship. And so he's even Buber's still beginning with the me. And I would suggest that we flip it and there is a thou, a parental thou, that is your source, that is your ground, right? That is your origin, that pre-exists you. And so it's not I-thou, it's thou. And then the I is born into relation. And it's being born into that relation that I receive that message, you matter. Because, as we would say in our faith, you are a child of God. Which brings me to my final story. So Chris Arnade traveled around 2016 through the country through what he called back row America. This is urban, poor urban areas, poor rural areas. And he just talked to people who were just on the economic margins of society. And Arnade was not a person of faith, but he said the thing I kept bumping into over and over again was just how religious everybody was. And he said, I found myself sitting, meeting people in McDonald's. That was his base camp. You go to McDonald's and have coffee, you're going to meet back row America. And because the other place I found myself sitting a lot are in folding chairs in little churches. And And he said, as an agnostic and atheist, he discovered the power of spirituality, and the power that it gave people was this: dignity. It gave them cosmic significance. It was a source of existential mattering. And so I'll end on this story. He is in New York City interviewing a prostitute named Takesha. And after I read it, then we can pause, and do we have time for some Q&A? So I'll end on this, and then we kind of go into a Q&A session. So this is Arnade writing. He said, Takesha was standing alone by a trickling fire hydrant, washing her face. She was working that night, wearing thigh-high, faux leather, red boots, leopard print pants, and waving at whatever truck or car passed by. I had seen her before, and she had always smiled at me and waved. And so we talked. And over the next hour, she told me her story. She told me how her mother's pimp put her out on the streets when she was 12. How she had her first child when she was 13. How she was addicted to heroin. And so I ended by asking her the question that I asked everybody I photographed. How do you want to be described? And she replied without a pause, as who I am, a prostitute, a mother of 6, and a child of God. Very hard life, but that last line, cosmic significance, existential mattering, as a ground of psychological resiliency. Thank you guys for coming tonight. Let's shift over to some Q&A.